So thank you all so much for coming. It is an honor to welcome you to Asia and Asians at Harvard, sponsored by the Asia Center, but let me immediately give full credit where credit is due. The idea for this conference, the design for this conference, the entire vision for it came from Sugata Bose, who came to us a couple of years ago and said, there is an entire history, largely unwritten, that we could put together about all of the students, faculty, visitors from Asia who have been coming to Harvard since the late 19th century, the ways they have affected Harvard, shifted Harvard, altered our entire disciplines. Also, the ways that Harvard has played a role in policy, sometimes wonderfully, sometimes, sadly, not at all, but the degree to which Harvard has played a role in policy dealing with Asia, and of course, building from this a huge number of questions for us as a community of where to go. What is the future? How should we engage Harvard Asia going forward? What have been the great successes that we can build upon? What have been, and yes, we will see some, the horrible failures that we need to learn the lessons from. And his vision was the following. What if we put together a conference, because this goes way beyond what any one single human being could do, let's put together a conference and let's bring people together to speak on this topic, talk about this topic, but specifically doing it as a conference, meaning we will have a full community here talking about it, thinking through all of the implications. I would also like to add that Sugata is also this very semester organizing a course in which students themselves are doing much of this research, and I'm very honored to say we will be hearing from many of them over the next 2 days. Their work has been incredibly exciting. So our deep thanks to Sugata for organizing this. Well, I should temporarily for coming up with the idea, for organizing it and developing such an incredibly important vision for all of us. Let me also continue with these thanks by giving a huge round of thanks to, first, all of the Asia Center staff who have been amazing, but particularly Tenzin Yododop has been amazing at every step of the way, contacting people, working with people. Those of you who are presenting have undoubtedly been in constant contact with Tenzin. He has been absolutely extraordinary. So let's embarrass him horribly by saying, Tenzin, thank you so much for all that you have done. And also, the entire Asia Center staff has just been absolutely extraordinary. You have seen Julie above handing out all of the materials for you. You will see Jackie repeatedly putting together all of the coffees and all of the foods. And throughout, a constant help has been also our assistant director for Southeast Asia Studies, who foolishly is in the room, so I get to embarrass him as well, Jorge Espada. So thank you so much, Jorge. And as always, our extraordinary executive director, Rachel Walsh, who unfortunately can't be here today, but she sends her deep regards, and she, of course, has been absolutely extraordinary. So our deep thanks to Sugata, to Tenzin and the entire Asia Center staff, and of course, a huge thanks to all of you for being here. The presenters, obviously, but also the rest of you, because we do envision this as a place where we as a community can think together, work together, and indeed look forward in terms of what we can do. So our deep thanks to you. And with that, let us begin with our first panel. And to do so, let me say a few words of organization. So our goal here has been, and this will be true throughout the entire conference, to really organize this conversationally, by which I mean we will have, in this case, 2 presenters. Other panels will be 3, 4, 5 presenters. Each will give a talk in turn. We will then open it up for conversation. Those conversations can be directed to any one of the presenters, in this case, either Sugata or Susan, both of whom I'll introduce momentarily. They can be given to the entire panel. They can be very specific. They can be grand and general. And our hope is to run this entire conference as a conversation. So with that being said, let me begin with our first speaker, and I won't embarrass you too horribly, but I will say a few words. So I'm very honored to introduce for our first speaker, Susan Pharr, who is the Edwin Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics. As most of you know, but I will say it anyway, what has marked her career has been, yes, a specialty on Japan, but her entire work has been to say, how do we think about Japan comparatively? And going the other way, how do we rethink our comparative models once we take Japan seriously? How do we understand our issues of social change, democratization, development, civil society once we bring Japan into our discussion? This has resulted in many, many, many publications, and since we are going to be in conversation here, I won't take 2 hours to read out the full list of publications. However, what she has done in all of this work is bring Japan into our comparative discussions. And let me just mention one, if you haven't read it, it happens to be a personal favorite of mine, The State of Civil Society in Japan, a wonderful work which, as the title implies, is about civil society. But the question is, how do we rethink our understandings of civil society once we take Japan seriously? How do we understand Japan once we put it within this larger framework of comparative studies? A perfect example of what has been animated her work throughout her career. And another piece of her more recent work has been focusing on the linkages between, yes, Harvard and Japan. So we thought she would be a perfect person to begin our discussion today. So please join me in giving our very warmest welcome to Susan Pharr.
Well, I'm very delighted to be here today, and my interest in coming to this group comes partly, of course, from talking about Japan, and which I'll be doing today, but also for 20 years until I retired in 2021. I taught a graduate seminar called Civil Society East and West. In that seminar, typically, I taught it with Grzegorz Eckert, who is a specialist on Poland, Eastern Europe, and we taught it together all those years with around 10 to 20 students each year, all of them international students, and many of them from Asia, almost every country in Asia through the years. So out of that experience of working in the seminars, I also advised many theses on topics relating to Thailand, to Bangladesh, to Korea. So it is a real privilege to be here today, and I so much support this endeavor today to look at international students and their experiences. So why do we start with Japan in a conference that really focuses on international students? And the reality is it's because Japan was first. The first students to arrive from Asia at Harvard arrived in 1872 and were from Japan. So later on, by 1880, students were coming from China. By 1906, they were coming from Korea. The figure I have for India is 1910. We can talk about start dates, but for sure, Japan was first. So it's reasonable then to ask the question, what was their experience? What did they contribute to Harvard? And what did they contribute to their own country, to Japan, from being here? And then there's a question also that I'll return to at the end of the presentation today, which is, how was their experience, and over time the experience of international students at Harvard, affected by politics, the larger context in which they had their own individual experience at Harvard? If I look at the students who've come through Harvard, and from Japan, there were roughly 5,000, over 5,000 at this point. But what we'll be looking at is essentially three waves. The first wave from 1872, the first arrivals, going on to around 1900. Then from 1900 to the early 20s, and then from the early to mid 20s, right down to Pearl Harbor and World War II. So the other three waves. So let me begin by setting the context. So Japan had opened, as it were, using the word open, in 1853. And Admiral Perry was the key figure there, but by the way, he was from Rhode Island. And what I mean by that is, in this part of the country, there was intense interest in what was going on in Japan. The first diplomats began to arrive from Japan. They came in full regalia, and they were a subject of marvel and wonder on the part of people in places like New York, where there was soon a ticker-tape parade. It's a little hard to see from a newspaper. In 1860, 500,000 people came out in the streets, hung from lampposts, to see this wonderful spectacle. And here we have Walt Whitman in 1890 calling them princes of Asia. People were dazzled by the samurai regalia. In the midst of this, by 1871 to 1873, came a delegation of around 50 senior people from Japan who were going to Europe and the United States to learn from the West. They came to Boston, and to get a seat at the banquet in their honor was an incredible privilege. On the right here is Charles Eliot, the new president of Harvard. He was so glad that he made it to the head table. This was such an event. And people like the famous figure in this part of the world, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was a speaker at the banquet. The biggies were all there. Now, what's so interesting now as we cut to the issue of education is, so basically the Iwakura mission came to Harvard or came to Boston for 5 days only, and their purpose was to look at education. But what they had, and this is a picture from Europe of the delegation, but you can see in the back row, there were what you might call stringers, young people who went along with the Iwakura mission, and the idea was that they would spin off and enter prep schools so that they could gain the knowledge and do the learning necessary to get them into a place like Harvard and other higher educational institutions. Why were they shooting for prep schools as opposed to institutions of higher learning? Because they had such little knowledge of the West. Meanwhile, Harvard University and Harvard College, by the time that they were entering Harvard College, entrance was by a seated examination on campus that went for 22 hours. That included Greek and Latin, that included either French or German, and English composition. Imagine if you were coming right fresh out of Tokugawa, Japan, to face an exam like that. So they couldn't, so they went to the prep schools and tried to find a way to get into them. So out of this excitement going on about Japan, it began to arrive students from Japan. The first ones entering Harvard Law School. Migata became a very famous Japanese, but one thing about these newly entering students who came to Harvard is that they were almost universally samurai. Some were lower-ranking samurai, many were high-ranking samurai, but one interesting thing about them is in most cases, they actually weren't all that well off. They were sponsored maybe by the daimyo of the former daimyo where their family had lived, and they were not necessarily doing all that well. So their means were somewhat limited. Megata was a little better off because the daimyo had, in fact, from Fukuoka, was sponsoring him and gave him a decent amount to live. But he worked like a dog in the prep schools to get ready eventually to have the interview to go to Harvard Law School. Now you might think, well, why Harvard Law School? Because it was easy to get into compared to the college. The law school, you didn't even have to have a college degree to get into the law school. If you were 19 years old, you could get into the law school as long as someone wrote a testimonial that you had strong moral character. So this is why they went to the law school. Here, part of their experience, all of these students, and frankly, up until today, Japanese students are very good at finding mentors, finding people to help them get through their education and figure out how things work. Amazingly, Migata developed a relationship with Oliver Wendell Holmes, who later served on the Supreme Court, who invited them into his home and often stayed up to midnight coaching them in their prep school to get them ready for the interview, and then he engineered their interview at Harvard. Another famous Japanese, these are people who, here's Kaneko Kentaro, later became the architect, the chief drafter of the Constitution, first Constitution of Japan. He was later a minister of justice. So these are very outstanding people. We finally get to the brave souls among Japanese who, after their prep school experience, are ready for that 22-hour exam. And these were the first two. But Kikawa, ironically, didn't even plan to come to Harvard. He was one of those stringers with the Iwakura mission. His plan had been to come, basically the Iwakura mission would branch out, and one wing of it would go to Europe and another to some different part of the US. He was with the group headed for the East Coast, taking a ship from Japan. Idea was you arrive in San Francisco, you go cross country to the East Coast, and then you go to England, which was his destination. His dream was Oxford. Unfortunately, when he got on the train, he was traveling in winter, and there was an incredible snowstorm. And he got to Salt Lake City, and it was impossible to go further. The snow mounted up. He was stranded for 3 weeks, at the end of which time he had basically run through his money. And it was impossible for him, once he got to the East Coast, to go any further, so he had to settle for Boston and shoot for Harvard. To mention just one other of the first that we're talking about in this first wave was a scholar who got the first PhD for a Japanese student at Harvard. His field was botany, and he was an outstanding student who did a dissertation on the Kuril Islands. It's botany. So in the big story of study abroad, Harvard actually was not like a top destination. Frankly, the students from Japan who were able to get the limited number of government scholarships wanted to study in Europe. So the people who came to the US were basically coming on private money and scraping it together to be here. And Harvard, because it was somewhat more expensive among the options in the US, it tended to have fewer students. Harvard cost at the time $150 a year. Michigan cost $25, which is one reason why Michigan had so many more students. So these were the first wave then, and I've mentioned some of them. Migata became a delegate to the first the League of Nations Assembly. Komura became the foreign minister of Japan and held important diplomatic posts in China and Russia. It was really an important architect of early Japanese foreign policy. Kaneko, as I mentioned, drafted the Meiji Constitution, and when you mentioned, Miyabe a moment ago, a poppy was named for him, but he became really the father of botany in Japan on the strength of his experience at Harvard. So these were very outstanding people. Now, so you think, well, what did Japan get from sending students to Harvard? Well, Harvard suddenly came on the screen in Japan as a seat of a lot of innovation that was going on, particularly in, for example, how you taught in the law school. The law schools were beefing up and professionalizing during those years. So the private universities in Japan were very attentive to what was going on at Harvard. So Harvard really became a model for places like Keio and Waseda. Another kind of gain for Japan is that the people who came to Harvard found themselves were heavily into either diplomacy or law. And within diplomacy, they suddenly knew the big players in diplomacy. So by the time the Portsmouth Treaty negotiations following the Russo-Japanese War, in those meetings, you could see that there were Roosevelt was there negotiating, and then there were everyone in the Japanese delegation were all Harvard students, as was Roosevelt. So they had an insider Harvardian relationship in the negotiation, a big advantage for Japan over, for example, the Russians. So the experience of the Japanese at this point, coming through in this first wave, was really quite positive. Kikawa called his time at Harvard College the brightest page of his entire life. And he then, once he returned to Japan, in not so many decades, he was organizing the Harvard Club of Japan in 1898. The Harvard Club of Japan, and this speaks to the issue of what these students did for Harvard. In a concrete way, they made a major contribution to the kickoff for Asian studies at Harvard, because they sponsored a scholar from Tokyo University to come here and to teach a course on Japanese literature and life, and also Japanese Buddhism. And so after that time, people began to be more and more interested in having courses on Japan, and that's the basis for all this incredible life we have at Harvard of international studies life. So now we're at the second wave, and by the time we get to 1900, things get really quite diverse in the number of students coming. The numbers are picking up past these law and diplomacy-centered people, and what you find is, at the very top, a new kind of Japanese coming to Harvard. And many times they, too, were from samurai families, but what was striking is that they were from families that had done very well in Japan's modernization. They were very well off. And what happened is they got quite swept up into the Brahmin culture of Boston. They were in the prestigious clubs of Harvard. And incredibly, thinking back, at a time when there was discrimination against Jews, against African Americans, Japanese were accepted into the most prestigious clubs at Harvard, along with people like Roosevelt. So this second wave produced also people who were beginning to go to all the other schools. So if you look, you see law school, 1874, the first Japanese graduate, and through the divinity school. But after 1900, these other schools, as Harvard itself professionalized, opened up, and they were the first Japanese in all these different schools. So the peak year was around 1915, but people like Yasui Kono became in Radcliffe, so a whole new stream of women from Japan came to Radcliffe. She became a professor at Todai, and while she was here at Harvard, by the way, at Radcliffe, she made straight A's, which was a killer thing to do at the time. Also, by that time, the Japanese Navy was sending people to Harvard. So when you look at the climate surrounding developments from around 1900 to the early 1920s, initially things were quite positive. After the Russo-Japanese War, there was a huge celebration. This is University Hall. You see Harvard College students wearing high hats, top hats, celebrating Japan's victory and shouting banzai over Japan's victory in that war. But as the 20s progressed and we moved from the second wave to the third wave, things began to go downward, much more tension in U.S.-Japan relations. And by the late 1920s, there were many, many Chinese on campus, far more than Japanese, and they were naturally mobilizing support for their country and including money to bomb Tokyo. They actually were demonstrating for that purpose. You can see them in uniform racing. And by the way, no one at the time was saying that foreign students shouldn't take part in demonstrations. They were demonstrating. And in fact, in terms of the climate of Harvard, Harvard's president, Lowell, had stepped down as president of Harvard in 1933. But if you look throughout the 1930s, he was a leading figure in trying to get an economic embargo of Japan. So in other words, the atmosphere on campus was very tense, so that by the end of that period, you can see a lot of tension. Harvard, however, during these years, kept up its relationship with Japan. The Harvard baseball team, for example, played a game. They were killed. It was embarrassing. In fact, the Waseda team, as a gesture almost of pity, gave them the trophy, and which you can find in a case in the athletics department here. But also, when Harvard was celebrating its 350th anniversary in 1936, you can see that there is Anisaki, the Japanese who earlier had taught the course on Buddhism, Japanese life, and so on. He was being given an honorary degree at that ceremony, and he in return gives Harvard a stone lantern. We don't know quite where that is at the moment. And by 1936, the Harvard Club of Japan was celebrating Harvard's anniversary. And in fact, the Harvard Club of Japan continued to have meetings up until around 1938. So here we are, just to give a sense of things. You can see from basically 1916, the peak year, so the period I'm talking about, roughly 1904, you can see that's when things were pretty high numbers, and then beginning in 1922 or so, the spiral is down to the point that we get to 1940, Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor, and this is the last part of my talk, but let me just mention Shunsuke Tsurumi. Tsurumi-san was the only Japanese student in Harvard College on December 7th, 1941. This is a very bad thing, a very bad spot to be in. It's hard to even imagine what that was like. The FBI went to his attic room. He had a little room on the third floor of a house, and the FBI interrogated him in his room. He said there's a really nice quote for him. They stripped me bare and took my thesis. He was a senior. He was working on his senior thesis. It sounds almost like a thesis is a body part, but they took his thesis from him, but then they restored it the next day. So in fact, and later we interviewed Tsurumi Sensei for this project, but he said the treatment wasn't all that bad. Once he was jailed at the Charles Street Jail, which is, by the way, you can see 3 stops on the Red Line. If you get off at Mass MGH, it's right near, it's the Liberty Hotel today, but the bar is still called the Clink, which is the slang name for jail. So Tsurumi-san was faced with one of those very important questions in life where your answer really matters. The FBI said, "Whose side are you on?" Unfortunately, he was a philosophy major, and his answer was neither. Actually, I'm something more like an anarchist. Not smart. Sorry, Tsurumi Sensei, this was not a smart answer. So to bring things to a conclusion, so naturally throughout the war, there were no Japanese at Harvard. But the interesting thing is the moment the instrument of surrender was being signed, on the deck of the ship where the signing was taking place was a Harvard graduate right behind the Japanese prime minister getting it signed. And it's really quite fascinating. I also have done work on the occupation of Japan. And you can look at the Stars and Stripes, which was the newsletter of the military, and there's a tiny little item in week 8 of the occupation of Japan. And it says, let's start up the Harvard Club. And they called the date for it, reserved a room, and pretty soon the former combatants were coming together, brought together by their ties to Harvard. So that's the end of my talk, and may I just say in conclusion, today we live in a period in which international students are being buffeted by many forces, political forces. But the story I've told today is one in which the overall story of a 150-year relationship between Japan and Harvard, it's all politics. The trajectories of the 3 waves had to do with external factors. And I think what you can see is that students weather this and have great resilience. And in fact, their experience at Harvard throughout these years, even in the worst times, in fact, are not all that bad. And Tsurumi is a good example because his advisor assured him that he would graduate with this class, not at the ceremony, but he would graduate at the same time. So he did his senior thesis in the Charles Street jail, sitting in the only place where you could really work and had adequate light, which was the toilet. And he wrote his senior thesis on the toilet in the Charles Street jail. And his advisor came to the jail and gave the oral examination. And the following summer, he was returned to Japan on a prisoner of war exchange ship. So this is the resilience of the Harvard, I think, looking after its international students, even through the most difficult days, and the great resilience of the students themselves, like so many of you today.
Thank you. So let me immediately turn to Sugata Bose, who I've already mentioned is, of course, the organizer of this conference, the figure who came up with the key ideas and even designed the format of it. But here, let me give him a proper introduction. Sugata Bose is the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs. His work has involved trying to rethink all of Asian history by seeing the connections, the linkages, the entire interaction spheres that have largely defined the past 150 years. Here, too, I will not waste 2 of our hours by reading his full CV. However, let me again mention 2 works that have been absolutely extraordinary, and here, not just for me personally, but I think everyone here would agree. The first one is, of course, 100 Horizons, looking in detail at the interaction spheres across the Indian Ocean, looking at the period of 1850 and to 1950. And the second one, his most recent book, Asia After Europe, looking at the key period in the post-colonial era when Asia is reimagined and redefined. How do we throw off Western assumptions, Western visions of governance, and recreate a world of Asia through this interaction sphere, a work that fundamentally changes our understandings of what we now know to be Asia. He, of course, is also working on a project of looking at the linkages between Harvard and the development of Asia. He has, of course, developed this entire conference accordingly, and will now be speaking about a piece of that work. So please join me in giving Sugata our very warmest welcome. Thank you.
It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I would like to thank Michael for his enthusiasm in supporting this idea for the last year. And I want to reiterate that we wouldn't be here this evening without Tenzin.
Yes.
And he has not only helped me in organizing this conference, but he has played a crucial role in putting together an exhibition that you will see upstairs. There are many students who inspired me, and I'll be mentioning them as I go along with my opening remarks. Now, many Asian pioneers created the pathways that today's scholars and students have followed to arrive in these portals. In August 1893, Vivekananda had a stopover in Boston on the way to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. John Henry Wright, professor of Greek at Harvard, described him as more learned than all our learned professors taken together. Vivekananda returned a year later, in May 1894, and first addressed the women at Radcliffe. His second lecture took place in Seaver Hall, in the Yard. The Crimson reported, "He believes that there are many ways of coming to God, that a man who is truly religious rises above the petty quarrels of sect or creed." He was hosted by Sarah Ole Bull at 168 Brattle Street in Cambridge, an address that would become a home away from home for many Asian visitors. In 1913, Rabindranath Tagore was invited to Harvard. Even though the formal letter of invitation came from James Horton Woods, who you see here in a wonderful portrait, then an assistant professor of philosophy, it was the Japanese art critic Okakura Tenshin who was instrumental, as I think Mo Banerjee will show us tomorrow, in getting his friend Rabindranath here. Tagore delivered 5 lectures at Emerson Hall in February and April of 1913, which formed the basis of his book, Sadhana, a Realization of Life, published later that year. This is a painting done by Mukul De on a later visit in 1916. The Nobel Prize for Literature, the Crimson reported somewhat awkwardly in November 1913, has recently been awarded to the British Indian poet, Mr. Rabindranath Tagore. This is the first time that the award has been made to other than a member of the white race. Last spring, Mr. Tagore gave a series of lectures in English at Emerson Hall, dealing with subjects of Far Eastern philosophy. The Bengali poet's handwritten notebook containing the poems of Gitanjali, which won him the Nobel, is now a treasured possession of our Houghton Library. And they have arranged a pop-up exhibition for all of you this weekend for you to see the original notebook in which these poems were written. Were there South Asian students at Harvard at the time of Tagore's visit? Yes, indeed. 4 students from Bengal became part of Tagore's entourage. Narendranath Sengupta, studying psychology, Hiralal Roy, chemistry, Jatindranath Seth, physics, and Bijay Kumar Sarkar, economics and sociology. They had all come on scholarships from the National Council of Education, funded by patriotic philanthropists associated with the Swadeshi movement that had challenged British rule in 1905. In fact, the Harvard note is a bit misleading because these students were not sent here by the government. In fact, they were sponsored by anti-government figures, but they had named their association grandly National Council of Education, and the $600 that was sent came from Indian patriots who wanted to support these students with scholarships. Now, these students arrived here in 1909 and graduated in 1913. Sengupta from Tetulia village in Faridpur district of Bengal and Roy from Pachpaika village in Dhaka district were outstanding students who won top scholarships in their senior year. They returned to India and became distinguished scholars and institution builders in their respective fields. After studying psychology as an undergraduate with professors like Hugo Münsterberg, Sengupta received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 1915. He founded the Department of Psychology and the first lab in experimental psychology at the University of Calcutta on his return, and had a fruitful collaboration with a great social scientist, Radhakamol Mukherjee, who actually wrote that report in the Modern Review in 1911 about the 7 students who had been sent to the United States, 4 of them to Harvard. This is a book that was jointly authored by Narendranath Sengupta and Radhakamol Mukherjee. After further training in Germany, Hiralal Roy became India's pioneering chemical engineer and founded Bengal Chemicals. These graduates of 1913 were, however, not the very first South Asians to graduate from Harvard College. Earlier this semester, I took my students to the Harvard University archives. There we discovered that a formal dinner of the Cosmopolitan Club in 1909, attended by the incoming and outgoing Harvard presidents, Charles Eliot and Abbot Lawrence Lowell. At that dinner, the Toastmaster was a student named Dhiren Chandra Gupta from India. He came from Narayanganj in Bengal and graduated in 1912. Another student present at that dinner was Gupta's classmate, Jai Singh Gaikwad, the eldest son of Maharaja Sayaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda. Preceding them by a year was Jogesh Chandra Sen, also from Narayanganj in Bengal, who received his AB in 1911 and upon graduation got his first job in the princely state of Baroda, whose ruler had visited Harvard in 1906. Apparently, Jai Singh Gaikwad created quite a stir back in Baroda by taking his Harvard mates there after graduation in the summer of 1912. Students from India attending Harvard between 1907 and 1919 were D.N. Sen from Dhubri in Assam, Sripada Krishna Belvalkar from Pune, S. Rao from Bangalore, Sridhar Venkatesh Ketkar from Amravati, Fateh Chand Talwar from Punjab, Jai Singh Gaikwad, Narayan Vishwanath Banvalikar, Rauji Raghunath Shirgaokar, and N.B. Mehta from Baroda, and Jogesh Chandra Sen, Dhiren Chandra Gupta, Narendranath Sengupta, Hiralal Roy, Jatindranath Seth, Bijoy Kumar Sharkar, S.C. Banerjee, Shurendra Kumar Roy, Hitish Chandra Basu, and S.C.D. Burman from Bengal. Shuren Roy from Noshingdi in Dhaka was my mother's maternal uncle. He did a master's in electrical engineering at Harvard between 1912 and 1914. His younger brother, Kiran Roy, would come to MIT in the 1920s and is featured in Sana Iyer's wonderful exhibition as one of the first 10 South Asian graduates at MIT. And he actually married an American-Polish woman who returned with him to India. Their Swadeshi father, Lalit Mohan Roy, had refused to send them to Oxford and Cambridge. Together on their return, they set up Bengal Lamp, which manufactured electric bulbs lighting up middle-class Bengali homes. And they also played a very major role in setting up an engineering college, which later transformed into Jadavpur University in Bengal. The earliest South Asian student to receive a Harvard degree, as far as I can tell, and here, it goes far back beyond 1910, as far as I can tell, was Probala Ramachandraya, a graduate of Madras Christian College, who was awarded an MD by the Harvard Medical School in 1898. The first South Asian to get a Harvard PhD was Subharama Swaminathan in the year 1900. Having graduated from the University of Madras, Swaminathan studied law in Edinburgh and was called to the bar in London before coming to Harvard in 1899. The next year, he presented a beautifully crafted and handwritten PhD dissertation titled "Of Custom in its Juridical Aspect, with special reference to the administration of Oriental law by British tribunals." In his conclusion, he urged the rulers of the land to have, quote, "more faith in the progressive character of the people," unquote. On his return, he practiced law in the Madras High Court and has been overshadowed in public memory by his illustrious wife and daughters. He married Ammu Swaminathan, a leading light of the women's movement in India. His elder daughter, Lakshmi Swaminathan, later Saigal, became the legendary commander of the Rani of Jhansi Women's Regiment of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army during World War II. His younger daughter, Mrinalini Swaminathan, later Sarabhai, was the doyen of Indian classical dance. And who then was the first South Asian woman to study for a degree at Harvard? It was Manik Kosambi, who joined Radcliffe in 1919 and graduated in 1922, 3 years after 2 Chinese women had paved that path. She was the daughter of the Pali scholar Dharmanand Kosambi, who had come as a visiting researcher to Harvard. Her younger brother, Damodar, was also a student at Harvard and graduated summa cum laude in 1929. A mathematics concentrator, he also read history, German, and Italian, and went on later in life to become one of the finest historians of ancient India. There were about as many students who came to Harvard in the 1920s as in the 1910s. Among them were S. Khan from the Northwest Frontier in 1922-23, K.C. Majumdar from Tipura in Bengal, who received his PhD in 1923, and Biraja Shankar Guha, who wrote his PhD dissertation in 1924 on the racial basis of the caste system in India. Guha went on to become one of India's pioneering anthropologists. Now, when I put in Subharama Swaminathan, the first Indian PhD at Harvard 1900, to do a Google search, AI responded saying that this is highly unlikely. India was a colony until 1947. It was virtually impossible for an Indian to have got a PhD in 1900. So, don't believe AI. I hope they are picking up what I said today, and it will get corrected. And Subharama Swaminathan, will the credit that is due to him. But I had to provide you with proof, going into the Harvard archives, finding his handwritten PhD thesis, which is truly a beautiful work of art. The second time I tried that search, I was told that the first person to get a PhD from Harvard was, in fact, B.S. Guha, but that's not correct either. He did get his PhD in 1924, but there were others who had preceded him. Now, we need to unearth diaries, letters, and memoirs of some of these scholars to get a better understanding of social interactions at Harvard between Asians and Americans, as well as among Asians from different countries. Kekawa Chokichi, who was mentioned, a Japanese student at Harvard College in the early 1880s, noted in his memoirs what he had lost as a result of his American education. Professor Pharr showed you a page from his handwritten manuscript. This is simply the published book, but there are his pictures there and also a section on what I lost by my American education. Dharmanand Kosambi had a tense relationship with Charles Rockwell Lanman, the Wales professor of Sanskrit, in the early 20th century. Conferences were held in the 1910s, especially on the West Coast, to promote solidarity among Asian students in the United States. Hu Gangfu from China graduated in 1913 with the 4 Indian students I have mentioned, as did a Thai student, Talat Samsen Ab. Now, how well did they know one another? Hu went on to submit his PhD thesis in physics on studies in X-rays in 1918. Here is the handwritten, signed cover page of that thesis. He had been preceded by his brother, Hu Minfu, who had graduated from Cornell but came and did his PhD here. He was the first Chinese student to earn a PhD in mathematics at Harvard. When the globe-trotting Bengali intellectual Binoy Kumar Sharkar visited Harvard in 1914 with the Swadeshi leader Lala Lajpat Rai, who is on the left over here. These are the famous Lal, Bal, and Pal, the leaders of the Swadeshi movement, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal. Lala Lajpat Rai spent several years in the United States and wrote a book titled The United States of America. Now, Binoy Sharkar sought out Anesaki Masaharu, the first Japanese visiting professor to teach at Harvard. And of course, as we've heard, Kikawa played a role because he was the head of the Harvard Club, and he sent Anesaki Masaharu to Harvard. Sharkar commented wryly that the scholar of Buddhism, Anesaki, was also playing the diplomatic role of preaching Japan's peaceful intentions while in America. At a gathering of writers in Tokyo the following year, Sharkar met Unokichi Hattori, a scholar of Chinese philosophy and literature, who was preparing to come to Harvard in place of Anesaki. You will hear more about Unokichi from Yan Yu, who is from Shanghai but is a visiting scholar at our history department this year, and she has been a great help with the Chinese materials that we have gathered, both for the conference and also the exhibition. Sharkar observed that the Japanese translation of Tagore's Sadhana, based on his 1913 Harvard lectures, had sold thousands of copies. The Japanese were not as appreciative of Gitanjali. Sharkar mused whether James Horton Woods's desire to bring professors from India to Harvard would be realized. It did not. In Woods's time, Woods passed away in 1935, nor in Sharkar's lifetime, who passed away in 1949. The intellectual engagement with Euro-America and the effective bond with Asia, I have argued in my book, Asia After Europe, represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a global future. Sharkar reflected on his contrasting experiences. In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place in those societies. They too were unable to accept me as one of their own. I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan. Yet standing on any street, in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In their gait and look, their posture, their manner of speech, their laughter and humor, their modest and respectful demeanor, their customs of greeting and serving guests. In all these matters, I have found India. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported some scraps of iron from Euro-America. In China, Sarkar wrote about the music that sprang from his heartstrings when he encountered Muslims there and commented on the thread of brotherhood woven by Islam across Asia. Sarkar was welcomed by American scholars and artists in New York and Boston once he returned to the United States between 1917 and 1919. And yet, it was his feeling awkward or oddly out of place that was captured in Florine Stettheimer's oil painting, Studio Party or Soirée. And that is Binoy Kumar Sarkar in front of the nude self-portrait of Florine Stettheimer. Students and scholars in the age of Swadeshi internationalism were finding their way to Japan, Germany, and the United States. Even the great anti-colonial revolutionary, Madame Bhikhaji Cama, wanted to send them to Harvard. I just discovered this letter in the archives introducing Bhikhaji Cama to the Harvard dean. It is ironic that Indian students were coming here as an alternative to the British imperial metropolis exactly at a time that Harvard affiliates were deeply involved in the US colonial conquest of the Philippines. The two most prominent men among them were Leonard Wood and Cameron Forbes, engaged in the project of disciplining colonial subjects with violence and, quote, civilizing, unquote, them with education and culture. The Wood-Forbes Commission, sent out in 1921, reported that the Filipinos were yet unfit for self-government and must be confined to the waiting room of history. This is just a teaser for you to return tomorrow to hear Eleanor Wickstrom's nuanced presentation on this subject. And of course, these were men who also influenced the curriculum back here at Harvard on colonial governance. In the early 1920s, Lothrop Stoddard, who had a BA and PhD from my department, published 3 books that contributed to the political environment surrounding the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Asians Exclusion Act of 1924, and I expect we'll hear more about it from Erica Lee tomorrow. Even Sun Yat-sen felt constrained to respond in his famous speech delivered in Kobe, Japan in November 1924. This American scholar, Sun Yat-sen said, considers the awakening of the Asiatic peoples as a revolt against civilization. Tagore had visited China and Japan earlier that year, and his friends set up an Asiatic association in Shanghai. There is on foot an important movement to establish Asiatic concord through the common culture of Asiatic nations, the Christian Science Monitor of Boston reported from Shanghai. Inspiration for the movement is acknowledged to Tagore, whose teachings permeate the issued declaration. The onset of the Great Depression led to a further buttressing of tariff walls and immigration barriers around the United States. Harvard observed its tercentenary in the middle of the decade. Professor Pharr has already mentioned that Anesaki Masaharu was awarded an honorary D.Litt. At that gathering. Another prominent Asian intellectual to be invited in 1936 was the Chinese modernist Hu She, who delivered a paper in which he compared what he called the Indianization of China with the Christianization of Europe in the Middle Ages. He too, like Anesaki, brought a gift with him. He presented a stele that still adorns the yard on the west side of Widener Library. That same year, Harvard's most renowned African-American alumnus, W.E.B. Du Bois, visited Japan and China. Of course, Du Bois has written in his memoirs that he felt in the late 19th century that he was in Harvard but not of it. He was a great champion of Asian and African freedom, but he underplayed Japan's nationalistic imperialism in relation to China that was about to undermine the cause of Asian solidarity. A year before that, in 1935, Anup Singh Dhillon had defended his PhD dissertation on India in the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization. He wrote in his concluding paragraph, "At present, countries like India and China do not play any conspicuous part in the League. But if they succeed in achieving political unity within, and in the course of time become strong nations, the League will have to count more and more on their cooperation." In 1946, he lobbied for the passage of the legislation in the United States Congress which permitted up to 100 Indians to acquire US citizenship. When independence was achieved in August 1947, Indian and Pakistani students here showed some grace in coming together at a time when the subcontinent was being torn apart by tragic partition violence. This photograph was published on the front page of the Boston Globe, and what is interesting is that Amarjit Singh is holding the Pakistani flag, and Irshad Hussain is holding the Indian flag. And also in the picture are Binapani Roy, who was president of the Hindustan Student Association that year, and Anand K. Kumaraswamy, who had succeeded Okakura as the curator of Asian art at the MFA in Boston. My own introduction to these hallowed precincts occurred at a rather early age of 2 in September 1958, when I accompanied my father, Dr. Shishir Kumar Bose, who came to Harvard Medical School as a Rockefeller Fellow and trained for about 15 months in pediatric radiology at the Boston Children's Hospital with a wizard in the field named Dr. Ed Newhouser. So Newhouser is here with his dictaphone reading x-rays. This is my father, just behind him in Frank Bensing's oil painting, which still hangs in the Newhouser reading room in the pediatric radiology department of Boston Children's. My mother, Krishna Bose's memoirs, provide a vivid portrait of Harvard and Boston in the late 1950s and record our visits to all the art museums and historic places of Cambridge and Boston. Now, this photograph of mine, taken on my 3rd birthday in 1959, flanked by Judy and Helen, must be somewhat unusual for the times. The happy picture does not reveal the full backstory. Helen had suggested to my mother that I should not be allowed to play with my friends Judy and her elder brother, Ricky, children of the only African-American family in the neighborhood. On being asked why, Helen had quoted her parents. "They are not nice people." A few days later, my mother found all the children playing house, with Helen in the role of the mother, Ricky the father, and of course, a yet-to-turn-3 Indian as their child. Unbeknown to me, and thanks to Harvard's internationalization at that time, I had been an instrument of desegregation along the banks of the Charles River. Now, my father had taken part in the freedom struggle, and he had spent long years in British prisons, so he chose to return to Calcutta, and he became, as Dr. Ed Newhouser used to say, the father of pediatric radiology in India, and headed the Institute of Child Health, the main teaching children's hospital of that city for decades, until he passed away in 2000. At his farewell party, Dr. Newhouser presented a large X-ray envelope to my mother, inviting her to decipher the difficult case it contained. Out came Frank Bensing's portrait of my father that still hangs on the wall of our family home in Calcutta. Once I was offered the Gardiner chair at Harvard in the year 2000, my mother was able to fish out a photograph of mine as a 3-year-old sitting with my parents in Harvard Yard, taken with a self-timer on her Rolleicord camera. If you look closely, you will see that I am actually reading, or at any rate, staring at a book. I went as a student from Free India to the old Cambridge, not this one. Yet, I imagine I was fated to come here eventually. When I arrived at Harvard as the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs in 2001, I became the first senior faculty to teach modern South Asian and Indian Ocean history at Harvard. And the way things are going, I may well be the last. Urged by my friend and colleague, Bill Kirby, I wrote up an academic plan in the fall of 2001 to develop the study of South Asia and build a South Asian Institute. It was adopted unanimously by the Harvard Asia Center in early December of 2001. There are at least 10 compelling reasons, I wrote, why Harvard cannot afford to neglect the study of South Asia. The first reason was that the subcontinent provides the empirical reference for some of the most sophisticated scholarship in a number of disciplines, including history, literary and cultural criticism, linguistics and philology, economics and anthropology. Now, there are many aspects of that vision that have not been realized. East Asian studies is well institutionalized at Harvard. South Asia and Southeast Asia have suffered woeful neglect. Yet the university is a place for the creation and dissemination of original knowledge. My students in the field of Asian and Indian Ocean history have been my greatest pride in the last 25 years. Their PhD dissertations have been and are being published as path-breaking first books, and there is the occasional dazzling publishable senior thesis as well. So here are some of the covers of these wonderful books, and the author of The Disinherited, which came out earlier this year, is present among us at this conference. And more books. It's amazing that, what has emerged in the last 25 years. And then I should clarify here that the book that is shown on this slide is in fact a Tufts senior thesis turned into a book, but of course I expect that the PhD dissertation on which we signed off in 2024 will also be published as a major book in the field of modern South Asian history. And finally, of course, there is a senior thesis that I advised, which swept the various prizes like the Hoops and the Tocqueville prizes. And here was a work on the Philippines. And I was the advisor because a South Asianist has to pretend also to be an expert on Southeast Asia here at Harvard. But again, with lots of thanks and congratulations to my students of the last 25 years. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you. So this has been an absolutely extraordinary opening to the conference. Both papers were amazing. Thank you both so much. And let us now open this up for conversation. And so we can begin to get to know each other. If I can also ask you to introduce yourself before your question. So questions of any kind. Sunju, but I have no idea who you are, so you must introduce yourself, please.
Sunju Kim, Korean history. So I have question to both of you, I guess. It's about how you got the information. So the first Japanese who received any degree from Harvard. As you know, I'm running this Korean alumni biographies project. And the first challenge was to get the data. In Harvard, I don't know whether they have digitized their graduate student names, where they came from and so on. But when I began in 2019, that data was not available. So my student and I went to the archive and we flipped through yearbook year by year from late 19th century to about 1980s before pandemic hit. And we put them together as a data, but the way we collected the data was by looking at the name. So we chose the person whose name sound like Korean. Along with it, we also gathered names that sound like Japanese and some Chinese as well. So I wonder how you got your data, especially for all those who attended and graduated Harvard early on. And another question to Susan is about the student who was here in 1942 when the war led him being jailed and so on. And in my data, there are several more Japanese students or students whose names sound like Japanese. And I wonder what happened to them, whether they were also jailed or taken out of school or anything like that.
Great, thank you.
So let me start with the second question first. It is true that there were several other students. They were graduate students, and they had a connection to the Japanese embassy. So they were allowed to return to the embassy and then head off with the Japanese delegation back to Japan. The problem of finding information is a monumental task. And I had never known if I'd known how difficult it was going to be, I'm not sure I would have embarked on this project for exactly the reasons you say. Harvard is not interested in, for example, knowing the characters, the kanji for a Japanese name. So you have a Kono or a Sato, and you maybe with an H, Inoue maybe spelled with a Y. So you have a very difficult task, and it's even more difficult because some Japanese adopted Western names, and then meanwhile you have Japanese Americans with a Christian name with a last name. So is that a Japanese who's adopted a Western name? So we used a combination of guidelines, and I'd be very glad that my project has been written up in the form of, now it's a chronology that is basically 500 pages of the chronology of the developments in Japan. But I have the sources I use, but essentially the methods you're talking about are exactly the ones we had to do it by making judgments on the name and erring in the side of thinking they might be Japanese American, in other words, try to be as strict as we could to try to winnow away the people we're pretty sure are Japanese. This also, the factor is what was their home address, which is shown in the directory.
Great. Thank you. And Sugata.
Yes, I mean, the methods that I followed were roughly the same as yours. I had to go to the Harvard University archives, look through the yearbooks. There are some, quinquennial reports. You go through the names and then try to figure out, whether they were from South Asia, which year did they graduate or get some other degree, and so forth. But this gives me an opportunity to also, thank several of my students who have been mentioned in the course of my remarks. I had wanted to do a project on South Asia and South Asians at Harvard in 2010, and for a variety of reasons, that did not happen. And then I found that a former student of mine who did her PhD here, Sana Iyer, did this wonderful project on South Asians at MIT. And I saw that, this was clearly possible, and there's great interest in this kind of work. Also, Mo Banerjee, who is here, had written a graduate seminar paper for me a long time ago on Mr. Tagore at Emerson. Just following Tagore's visit, we could see that there were at least these 4 students who were graduating that year. And Narendranath Sengupta in particular was writing in the Crimson and trying to demystify Tagore, that this was not just a mystic poet, that there are many other dimensions to this creative writer. Or he was trying to set the record straight when invited to speak at the Cosmopolitan Club after Tagore won the Nobel Prize. And of course, there was a few things that I knew. I happened to know the family of Subharama Swaminathan, so I knew that he had come to Harvard. But then I had to go and do a search in the Harvard archives and find his PhD thesis, and to discover that here is someone who got his degree in 1900, and we have his full handwritten PhD dissertation. And that immediately, pushed back the first degree holder by about, a decade or more. So the presumption was that the first students came with the Swadeshi wave and perhaps got their degrees around, between 1910 and 1913. So that was how we went about it. And I have to say that I realized the full potential of what could be found in the Harvard archives while I was advising Eleanor Wickstrom's senior thesis in 2023-24. And I realized that we actually can find a lot of material on Asian students, early faculty, visitors, and so on.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hello, professors. I'm fellows from Kennedy School, and I have questions. As I know, some students who have studied in U.S. have been put inside since 1949 because of some political reasons, but Harvard is special. As I know, at least 4 Harvard students played important role in PRC's government, especially in economic and diplomats. So I want to ask Professor, do you think Harvard is special, and what kind of role Harvard play in cross-cultural communication between China and US during 20th centuries? So thank you.
Thank you. In any order, please.
I guess is Harvard special? Well, certainly Harvard has, I think, there are other institutions in the U.S. Basically, in most of the 20th century, there have been 12 centers for Japanese and Chinese studies. And I think that in those centers, there's been a number of faculty have been public intellectuals, and at Harvard, certainly, there have been public intellectuals. people like Ezra Vogel, people like Edwin O. Reischauer, who was ambassador to Japan. So they have been very involved in the public domain of trying to understand and illuminate issues in U.S.-Japan relations, U.S.-China relations, and that triangle. And a lot is owed to Ezra Vogel in particular as that kind of public intellectual. But there have been others as well who've tried to play that role. Public intellectuals are at other institutions as well, but at Harvard it's been, I think, a very important part of the overall standing of the centers here on Chinese and Japanese studies that we've had so many people with that kind of public intellectual reach.
Yeah, since I was going through yearbooks and, plowing through the Harvard archives, looking for South Asian names, I was also coming across Chinese names and Southeast Asian names and Japanese names and so forth. And I knew, of course, that Professor Sunju Kim has a wonderful project on Korean alumni, the Biographies Project. I knew of Professor Susan Pharr's work on the Japanese. So I was, taking notes about Chinese students when I found them, if I didn't know very much about them. And that's how I figured out that here were these Hu brothers, Hu Min-fu and Hu Gang-fu, who were both here, who did their PhDs in the sciences, in mathematics and physics. And I was very lucky that Professor Yan Yu is visiting Harvard this year. So she discovered that the Hu brothers then went to Shanghai and had taught at the university with which she is associated now. But the question that you're asking, of course, is a very important one about how Harvard treated students at moments of political crisis or war. And we've seen, for example, the example of Surumi-san, Surumi Shunsuke. And I was reading one of his later books. He became quite an important intellectual in post-war Japan. And he dedicates one of his books to clearly his American landlady, somebody called Marianne Young, I think. It's quite fascinating because he's grateful that he was well looked after, even if he was thrown into jail after Pearl Harbor. And as was explained, his professor came and helped him with his senior thesis even while he was in detention. Now, something similar arises with China, the emergence of the People's Republic of China. And there was a student, the name is Ji Chaozhou, who was at Harvard at that time, and who has actually written a memoir. And he spent 2 years at Harvard, and clearly, he had a good time during his 2 years here, but he was constantly attentive to what was going on in China. Chinese students did face difficulties because with the onset of the Korean War, suddenly their funding was withdrawn. And then, for some inexplicable reason, their funding was restored, a few months later. But Ji sort of took a decision to return to China. His elder brother was a close friend of Chou En-lai. That may have had something to do with it. But he could see that the real action was in China soon after the establishment of the People's Republic. So he abandoned his Harvard education, and he describes his journey from Harvard Yard to Tiananmen Square. And his memoir is titled The Man on Mao's Right, because he would interpret for Chou En-lai and the Foreign Ministry, but he was also interpreting for Mao Zedong in 1959 on the 1st of October, on the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic. And there he was, standing on Mao Zedong's sort of right. So these were, complex scenarios. He does write that, in the early stages of the McCarthy era, things were not good for foreign students, especially for students from China soon after the People's Republic had been founded. But by and large, we get sort of a kind of a mixed report of some degree of institutional support at Harvard, but a very difficult general political sort of environment which was hard to negotiate. And I might just add that some of the figures that you've mentioned, Kase, who was on the USS Missouri, along with Shigemitsu, who was signing the instrument of surrender, he continued to play a very major role because it's in other research that I get to learn about them. So I was writing about Bandung and Japan's re-entry onto the international diplomatic stage at Bandung in 1955. And of course, the mastermind was Shigemitsu, who, having spent some years in prison, had returned and had become foreign minister again of Japan. And the Harvard alumnus, Kase, was there as a kind of his representative at Bandung, reporting back to Shigemitsu, how well Japan was being welcomed back into the International Committee of Nations in 1955 by other Asian countries.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And with apologies to about the 10 people who are holding up their hands, we will have to wrap things up for this panel. Please, however, there will be plenty of time for questions over the next day. So with my apologies, we will wrap things up here. And let us begin by giving our deepest thanks to these two extraordinary papers. Thank you so much. So Susan Pharr and Sugata Bose have begun this conference with two extraordinary papers and two wonderful discussions. So our deep thanks to this opening panel, our deep thanks to the paper givers themselves and to the wonderful questions. And our next move will be a wonderful performance. The Harvard Indonesian Students Association have agreed to come in and give a performance to us of traditional Sumatran dance. And then after that, of course, we will have a reception. So let us, and I assume it'll be here in this room? Okay, good. So let us bring this panel to a conclusion. And then meanwhile, let us welcome the Harvard Indonesian Students Association. Thank you so much.
Oh my God, I'm so nervous. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Asia and Asian at Harvard conference. And today we are honored to present Tari Piring, or the plate dance, one of the most iconic traditional dance from West Sumatra, Indonesia, exactly where I came from. I was born there, I was raised there. And historically, Tari Piring is actually originated from the Minangkabau communities, where my ethnic's from, as a form of gratitude to the gods and ancestors after a successful harvest. So at the times, farmers would offer performances using plates as a symbol of prosperity, and over time, the dance evolved from a ritual of thanksgiving into a cultural performances that reflects the Minangkabau spirit, which is graceful, dynamic, disciplined, and also deeply to community. And right now, in terms of philosophy, the plates represent the rasa syukur, or the gratitude, and also kerja keras, or hard work, and the Minangkabau values we deeply hold up to this day, which is adat basandi syara, syara basandi kitabullah. And it is a reminder for us that a culture and spirituality can walk together. The dancers' precise and rhythmic movements show balance in life, the harmony within the community, and resilience through challenges. In today's society, Tari Piring continues to be performed in celebration, weddings, festival, and diaspora events around the world. It survived because it carries the pride of a community, the memory of our ancestors, and an identity that Minangkabau people continue to cherish, no matter how far from West Sumatra we may be. And this afternoon performance is proudly brought to you by HISA, Harvard Indonesian Student Association, as part of our commitment to keep Indonesian culture alive, visible, and celebrated within Harvard community and beyond. And today, I'm proudly to introduce you our dancers, Camila Muyasara from Harvard Medical School, from Master of Medical Science in Clinical Investigation, class of 2026. Nur Rikazatul Lulu Furu from Harvard Medical School, Master of Medical Science in Global Health Delivery in class of 2027. And myself, Emir Gemilang Jayaringga from Harvard Medical School, also from Master of Medical Science in Global Health Delivery of class of 2027. Thank you. We hope this performance brings you a little piece of West Sumatra warmth and spirit. And don't worry, in the original versions of this dance, usually in practice, the plates sometimes break. But today, we make no promises. There may be another one. But hopefully there's no one. So please enjoy Tari Piring.
Wow, that was absolutely extraordinary. So thank you all so much. The dance was extraordinary. Our two opening talks were extraordinary. I very much look forward to the day to come. We do now have a reception outside, so please do join us. And then we very much look forward to continuing these conversations tomorrow morning. Thank you all so much.